Okay, let's give it like another minute and then we can get started.
Welcome to Dr. DeBella and Dr. Okamura for joining us early for the whole presentation as well.
We're very happy to have you.
Thank you.
Maybe we can get started and some people trickle in. I think that will be great. Welcome everyone. This is our second in our series about data management. We're very lucky to have today two NSF officers who at the end of this short presentation will be able to give us some insight of how things work internally. These two NSF officers are Stephen DeBelli, who is here, as well as Dr. Diane Okamaru. So let's get started. Can you go to the next slide, Suzanne? So the three of us prepared this presentation. Suzanne, who is like a data management expert, will be presenting most of this. Suzanne is a research scientist at Ohio State University and works with Virginia Rich. My name is Ann Mook. I'm a senior team scientist at Colorado State University at the Institute for Research in the Social Sciences. And I'm also joined by Dr. Brett Fredrickson, who works with the BII Ascend at University of Minnesota. So I would like to just set a couple of ground rules so that we can get the most out of this webinar workshop. So we really hope that you're all fully present with us, that you can minimize the distractions behind you. We would really love to hear your questions and we would love to hear you participate. If you have any questions, we first have this presentation, and during that presentation, you're more than welcome to ask any questions in the chat. Some of us may be able to answer them. But at the end of this presentation, you will also really have an opportunity to ask our NSF officers some questions about what they think about NSF data management at NSF.
Just let me know.
If possible, we would love to have your video on so we can see you and we know that you're with us. And if you have any background noises and you're not asking anything, we also ask you to please keep yourself on mute. We would love to get to know you a little bit. So if you have a question and you want to speak up, please identify yourself, say your name, university you're affiliated with. And as I just mentioned, please feel free to ask questions at any time in the chat because we are all here to answer those questions for you.
And one thing just to, you all saw the recording in progress prompt, but this is being recorded and this recording will be posted on YouTube, and the video file will also be published forever with a DOI, and I'll talk more about what that is later.
Awesome. Thank you, Suzanne. So this workshop is offered today by the Research Coordination Network, which is funded by the NSF, specifically for the Biology Integration Institutes. And as you can see here in our circle, there are several of these biology integration institutes, and some of them are really at the core, who have been organizing things together. And that would be Emerge. Suzanne and I both work with Emerge, as well as Broaden, who is at Colorado State, also works at my institute. Ascend, who is Brett is representing Ascend, Embryo, BPRI, and MSC. And then there's a couple of others that also have been assisting us in really compiling a lot of information together to really make research better for biologists and all adjacent disciplines. So what are we doing with this research coordination grant? So one thing that we really hope to do is that we can share all the wise lessons that we have learned over the past few years of managing large interdisciplinary teams and really, passing that knowledge on to other scientists like yourself. So one of the things that we're doing is we are compiling a website with a lot of tools where you can, have examples of what other big, research groups have been doing in terms of governance and infrastructure, in terms of team science, how do we well work together, science communication outreach, DAI and mentorship and evaluation. And, obviously specifically today we're talking about data management, which is also a huge part of teaming well in interdisciplinary groups. So I just wanted to show you like how important it is that we really think as a group how we are going to manage our data. Because when we do science, it's a team. There's people who are going to collect the data, there's going to people managing the data, there's people analyzing the data, reporting the data. And one of the cool things that we do within many of the BIIs that we manage, so emerge and broaden, is that we like to do social network analysis. And one of the questions that we ask is really like, who do you share your data with? And this is an example of emerge, which is a big team, has about 100 members in total. And as you can see, all these little dots are individuals, and the color represents the university where they work at. So you can see in our team, almost everyone is really working together on data sets. Very few people are not indicating that they share data with others. And it's not just across a few people, it's across a large team that are not just at one institution, that are at many different universities. So this is one of the reasons why we think we really need to think about how we manage our data well. And now I'm going to hand it over to Suzanne Hodgkins, who will have some tips and tricks on how to write a plan to do that.
Yes, thanks, Anne, for the intro. So we're going to be kind of presenting this in the way of just general things that you should be thinking about anyway as you're planning a project, not just for writing a data management plan for any specific grant, but just general things that are good to think about that most funding agencies ask you to include in your data management plans. So as Anne mentioned, it's important as you're working on a team to have buy-in from the entire team when you're talking about data management and not just rely on one person to manage all the data. So our example, the three of us co-hosts, me, Anne, and Brett, if we decide to write a grant, we should all talk together about how we should manage our data. So going into like the actual document that would be submitted with the grant application. So a data management plan, sometimes called a data management and sharing plan, is a document, usually 1 to 2 pages. For NSF, it's 2 pages, and it's submitted with a funding proposal, and its purpose is to outline your plans for managing and sharing the project's data. So NSF's data sharing policy here kind of states the broad kind of vision of like codified as a policy of what researchers need to do. So we're expected to share with other researchers within a reasonable amount of time the data, samples if applicable, and any other materials collected over the course of the project. And there are some links which Anne just dropped in the chat with some more, all of the specific guidelines for NSF proposals if you're interested. So going back to our team discussion example, one thing we need to talk about is what are the team's goals for the data. So kind of the purpose of a data management plan is to show overall how the project will follow the FAIR data principles. And I presented this at the last workshop, but it's worth reviewing. So these are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Findable means that the data is easy to find and to read, both for humans and computers. Accessible means it's easy to retrieve and open access. Interoperable means that the terminology is clear and consistent and references other data, which allows integration between different data sets. And reusable means that it's both well described to enable reproducibility and that the license it's published under allows reuse. And many of these qualities of the FAIR principles actually fulfill multiple of them. So there's considerable overlap here. So one thing that you need to think about, and that's actually requested in data management plans, is what kind of research products do we need to think about managing. So this goes to defining your data and related materials. So you need to think about what kinds of data will your project be generating. So here I've just listed a few data types that are used in eMERGE, sequencing, soil properties, images, weather, chemical spectra, and several others. All of these are very different and have unique sharing considerations depending on discipline conventions. And also, what other research products are you generating? So this might include physical samples and specimens that might need to be archived somewhere, software, publications, of course, and any other kind of digital items that you might want to share. So with all that in mind, thinking of the next thing is to think about specific strategies for managing all of this data and other material. So one piece of this is standards for data and metadata. So you might see this in the instructions, but wonder, what does that mean? So basically, it just means how you plan to standardize data and metadata format. Metadata is data about data. So this includes the like what the different variables are called, the naming conventions for different files, sites, habitats, etc. And this enables interoperability. So what is your overall strategy for standardizing your data to allow this interoperability? And what's recommended is community metadata standards. And these are widely accepted formal definitions and formats, which are broadly used across entire disciplinary communities. So here I've listed some examples, and all of these have very different kind of purposes and ways in which they're implemented. But what they all have in common is they define kind of like a standard format for different types of information. So semantic versioning, which I talked about last time, is a way of naming your versions of usually software, but can also be used for other things like data. And then here, this is an example of the environment ontology, or ENVO, which is a standardized way of naming different sort of mainly physical entities within the environment. So in this example, a lake is highlighted and it includes a definition. There's a code, which if you're using this minimum information standard about sequences, then you'll be asked to include like those ENVO codes with your habitats that your sequence came from. And so it's this hierarchical structure. This is just one portion of it, but this just ensures that different researchers are using the same terms to refer to the same thing. So another useful organization tool besides standards is to take all that standardized data and put it in a database. And this may or may not be useful depending on the size of your project, but especially if you have a lot of very complex data, it can be very helpful to help someone navigate that data. So here's two examples, which I won't go over in detail because of time, but if you'd like more information, you can check out these links. So the eMERGE database is a graph database that we use in eMERGE, which organizes data based on physical relationships between entities. So for example, a site has multiple cores, which has multiple core depths, and then each of those has data. And then we also have ways of storing file metadata and linking it back to data. This second example, the EcoCom DP model, which is used in some NEON and LTER data sets, but both of those being like very large kind of data collection networks. This is a data model, which is, well, it's not necessarily only used in a relational database, but that's kind of what it's designed for. And it's based on mapping between unique IDs, between tables representing different entities like observations, locations, taxons, etc. And just put in a chat, if a lot of this information that I'm mentioning was also kind of introduced in the previous workshop in this series, which is at that YouTube link that Anne put in the chat. So another component of data management that you need to think about is data preservation. And this is important both for published and unpublished data, although how you preserve these will differ depending on whether it's published yet or not. So there's multiple aspects of good data preservation. There's backups, of course, which you want to have both cloud backups and multiple kind of locally stored copies, ideally so that multiple people in your team can access them. You want to make sure that your files are readable and well documented so you can avoid this scenario. Someone sees a file, they don't know how to open it or even what it is. And longevity, so making sure your storage media is going to be good for a long period of time. So like if your computer crashes and all your data is on your computer, then your data is not lost forever. And this is important both during the award, because you never know about these kinds of disasters, and post-award, so that someone in the future who is maybe not you or even yourself 5 years from now, and you forgot what you did 5 years ago, can figure out what the data represents. And so this workshop is mainly about data, so that's what I'm focusing on, but it's also worth mentioning that if your project has physical specimens of long-term value, like fossils, that you should also plan on archiving those in a reputable collection and also documenting what they are. So the next component of data management planning is how you plan to share the data. So you need to think about what will be your general practices for sharing data with collaborators, and how and also when you will share your data with the public. And most funding agencies and journals recommend using community data repositories, which make the data accessible to the public long-term via persistent identifiers. So what are persistent identifiers? So I presented this last time, but a little review. So large-scale public data repositories, such as these examples below, commonly offer these persistent identifiers, most commonly digital object identifiers, or DOIs. Sometimes they also have their own customized accessions for different types of data, like NCBI does. And these are designed to stay constant even as websites might update their URLs. And this is enforced mainly via kind of administrative mechanisms, but this ensures that the data is preserved and available long-term, even years after the end of a project that generated the data. All right, so going back to our team discussions, after you've had a detailed discussion about how you're preserving, sharing, and organizing your data, another component to think about is data security. So if you're not used to thinking about data security, this basically relates to protecting against data loss or misuse. So kind of two different aspects of that. And some things to think about are some data may be illegal or unethical to publish, like some data relating to like medical patients' private health information is one example of that, which we'll talk about, and we'll talk about more later. In terms of how you need to think about encryption and password protection, if it's that kind of data that you're nervous about making completely public, and also using backups, which is mainly about protecting against data loss. So even if some ransomware destroys all the data on your internet connected devices, if you have backups, then you still have your data. So as far as intellectual property considerations, and a lot of researchers are concerned about others taking their data, scooping it, and using it in publications before the team that generated the data can publish their own findings. This is an understandable concern, but it's also important to balance this with the FAIR principles, in particular, minimizing restrictions on data reusability. So another reason to, if you're working on a publication, to get it out so you don't feel like you have to hide your data as you're still working on it. As far as how to communicate this, most of the time when you publish your data in a repository, you're asked to choose a license. And so Creative Commons licenses are what we recommend because these allow some degree of reuse. So when you're choosing one of these, this is a kind of handy visual so you can see exactly what the difference is between all of them. You want to consider how you're going to balance these confidentiality and security and intellectual property considerations with the need for fair data. All right, and now I will hand it off to Anne again, who will talk more about human subject data.
Yeah, so I think I am the lone social scientist in this group. And in my case, I work a lot with human subject data. Many of you may have received some of my surveys about interdisciplinary mentorship, etc., in which I had to go to human subjects just to make sure that all your data is private and will only be published in aggregated form. So what is human subject data? This can be any type of data that might either be biological, that includes maybe someone's blood or DNA or genetics, psychological data, maybe some observations or surveys that people have compiled, social and demographic data, behavioral data, and also health and medical data. So if you work with anything that has directly to do with any of the biological or social aspects of people, you usually have to go to the human subject review board, and you have to answer a number of questions to ensure that no one in your sample in any ways can get harmed by participating in the research or harmed because their private information is shared later on. So after you get that approval, you can do your research, and you can go to the next slide, Suzanne. And you have to make sure that everyone who participates in your research is informed. Sometimes that means that you can, for example, ask someone for their name and signature, that they know what the conditions are of the research and what are the risks and benefits for them to participate. Sometimes in specific populations, it may also be like a verbal consent or something like that. The other thing that you really have to be careful about is really thinking about people's privacy. For example, in the recent survey that I did with many of you that participated in the BII, we asked a lot of questions, maybe about your field, your discipline, your gender, whether you're a native speaker or not, and also how you rate your mentors in level of interdisciplinarity, how they help you in various things. And obviously, no one would want that data to, come out and say either positive or negative or neutral things about the people that you work with. So we really want to make sure that, that data does not get shared beyond myself or the people involved in that research, and that anything published is really like, over these 140 people that participated in this research, these are the things that we found. So when you work with this more sensitive data that is human subjects, you really want to think about, how do you store that data? So maybe having a passport, having it in a specific file or folder so that not everyone has access to that. Really thinking about, how do you maintain confidentiality about who participated or did not participate, or like what the specific things are that people said. And the other thing is that is maybe a little bit different from some of the FAIR principles, is sometimes really like, how long will you keep the data and will you ever publish that? Sometimes there may be requirements that data might be destroyed after 3 or 7 years, depending on different types of data. Another thing that you may want to think about is one step further, which are the care principles, which is more specifically if you are working with, maybe vulnerable populations or indigenous data. And what you really want to make sure, if you collect data from these people, is that there's a collective benefit. So you don't just want to have that data so that you as a researcher can publish and advance your career, but you really want to make sure that you're not extractive, but that you're kind of, giving back. The other thing that you really want to think about is that you kind of give some authority to control that data to the population that you're working with. And that may be really thinking about, before you publish something, you might want to really think about, checking in with those people, that the things that the conclusions that you make, that they are accurate and that they make sense. You also really want to make sure that you manage that data responsibly, and that you follow like all the ethics that you would do with any general population, but give specific consideration to the vulnerabilities that some of those populations may have. One of the cool examples that I think we have is actually several of the BIIs, including Emerging Ascent, and I think some of the other ones are working specifically with indigenous population. And Ascent, for example, collects a lot of high resolution landscape images on tribal lands to manage forest disease. But obviously, people don't necessarily want their homes or their local communities being exposed publicly on the internet. So before you are able to share something like that, or if you are ever going to share something like that, you want to have, that specific consent. I think another cool example might be something that may be the case with rare plants or animal species. And if you give that information publicly, that may create a community interacts that also like may be a risk of contamination or extracting those species, etc. Um, the like the tree that you see here is like the Florida Jew, which is a tree that, for example, has a lot of medicinal properties, and it's very rare. It's only found in a couple of counties in Florida, and many of them are actually on private land. So you may not want to expose where those plants are so that no one is facing trespassing and that those species can continue to be preserved. And then I'll hand it back to Suzanne. Suzanne, I think you're muted.
Thank you. Thanks, Anne. So now that you've talked about all of these considerations and balancing the need for open data with maybe the opposite needs to keep it private, now we need to talk about roles and who's doing what with regard to data management. So here, accountability for different data management tasks can be tracked with like what's called a RACI matrix, which stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. And this is basically an assignment of different tasks to different people in various roles with regard to who's involved and what kind of aspects of each task. So for example, if I'm responsible for collecting the data, that means I'm the one like running the instrument and taking down the measurements and maybe doing some data processing, but maybe my supervisor is accountable, meaning that she's kind of the person that others sort of look to see if the data processing has been done. And please feel free to chime in if I didn't explain that well enough. But basically, you just want to make sure you know who's doing what. So here, this set of tasks: data collection, data management, data sharing, data access and security, etc. So I won't go through all of these, but here you have like these list of roles like collectors, data managers, backup admin, which these might be different depending on your team structure, but each of these people or groups have well-defined roles. So that way you avoid the situation of, you know, assuming that one person was responsible for, say, sharing the data, but maybe they didn't know that was expected to be their role. But having it all spelled out really kind of helps everyone to know what they themselves are supposed to do, as well as to know who to ask if they see something that needs to be done. So with all of this, it's always possible someone might need to leave the team, sometimes unexpectedly. So let's say Anne gets a job elsewhere and then leaves. Then the rest of the team members are wondering, what do we do now? Because Anne still has all of our project's data. So this is a scenario which once it happens, it's very kind of hard to know what to do. Sometimes you can pester the people who've left to just send the data they have. Sometimes that works, sometimes not. But really the lesson here is to avoid this happening in the first place. So this is why, as I talked about earlier, you need to make sure your data is accessible and understandable to multiple people on the team. And so if one person leaves, then there is role redundancy. So one way that you can kind of lay all this out within a team is after your team or maybe the team co-leads have talked about like what are the strategies for data management, then you can come up with like a formalized data policy for the project. So this is an example of the data policy that Emerge has, and there's also a lot more content not shown on here, but things that it can include are like a high level description of the data management system, including any relevant website URLs that team members may need to know in order to know where to look for data from other team members. Some guidelines for timeliness and procedures for data sharing, the versioning system and data set quality control system, and how that is like how are different data qualities defined, intellectual property considerations, and best practices for using data in publications, including like how do you figure out who to credit for generating the data if you're using someone else's data, and roles and responsibilities for doing all of these things. I saw there was a question in the chat about whether this is publicly available. Yes, it is. It's so we have an internal version as well as kind of an externally shared version, which this is the screenshot of that, but I will share a link in the chat to the Emerge Toolkit website, which has a link to this data policy document as well as our data management plan. And this will also be collected with other materials for the RCN toolkit along with all the other BII's materials. So. Okay, so how do we make sure that all of this is properly done? So post-award data management refers to ensuring that your data management plan was adhered to. So if you're awarded a grant, then most likely that you'll need to talk in your annual and final project reports about what data was produced, what standards were used for metadata, how the data was preserved and shared. And this is also where you would put your DOI links or other persistent identifiers for your data, as well as any changes that you've had to make from the original data management plan. Like, for example, maybe you had originally planned to use one tool for making a database, and then that turned out not to be the best tool, so you use a different database. So that's one example of that. All right, so now with all of these components, this makes for a solid data management plan, which your team can then put in your grant application. And with that, I'll hand it over to Brett, who will be introducing our NSF guests.
All right, thank you, Anne and Suzanne, for a really great introduction and discussion about some of the team-based considerations for data management plans. So that's kind of our interpretation as research scientists of a lot of the guidelines that NSF has proposed in creating these data management and sharing plans. And even if you're not thinking about writing a specific proposal to NSF, I think a lot of these guidelines are important, particularly as early career scientists, to kind of think about and build upon as we continue our careers through science. But we're really here to listen to NSF's opinions on these types of materials, what makes a good data management and sharing plan, and why these types of skills and guidelines were recommended by NSF. In order to be included with a lot of the grants that are offered through the foundation. So what I'll now do is I'll introduce both of our representatives from NSF here. We have Dr. Diane Okamura and Dr. Stephen DeBelle, both of which have worked extensively with NSF and are experts within their given fields. Suzanne, if you can go back to Diane's slide, I'll give her a bit of more of a rundown. So Dr. Diane Okamura serves as a program director in the Plant Genome Research Program Cluster at the National Science Foundation. This is housed within the Directorate of Biological Sciences and Division of Integrative Organismal Systems. The PGRP supports basic discovery research on a genome-wide scale and or relevant to plants that are important to the U.S. economy, as well as developing tools, genetic resources, and technological breakthroughs that further enable functional plant genomics. In addition to the cluster responsibilities, the cluster also manages the Plant Genome Postdoctoral Research Fellowship track of the Postdoctoral Research Fellowship in Biology, something that may be of interest to a lot of the early career researchers here. Outside of the cluster, Dr. Okamura has received her PhD in biology from UCLA and is an expert in plant molecular genetics. She has a broad-based experience in cutting-edge genomic technologies and has held research and management positions in both academia and industry prior to joining NSF. So please welcome Dr. Okamura, and I'll give you a few minutes to introduce yourself in your own words if you'd like, Dr. Okamura.
Thank you, Brett. And thank you to Suzanne, Anne, and Brett for inviting us, Steve and I, to join you today. I think that what I'd like to say is give you a brief history of how data management plans came about. So I have been a program director at the National Science Foundation for over 19 years. And during that time, most of that time was associated with the PGRP, the Plant Genome Research Program. Now, this program was established by a congressional act as part of the National Plant Genome Initiative in 1998. And at that time, the goal of this initiative was to provide for a comprehensive understanding of the structure and function of plant genes and genomes. Now, to accomplish this, because this was early in the 1990s, it was agreed that we would probably need to develop the biological tools, sequence resources, and genetic resources necessary for studying plant genes and plant genomes, and that this would require, in order to enable the kind of research that we were convinced needed to be done to advance agriculture, was that all these resources, including data, software, germplasm, and other biological materials, would need to be openly accessible to all. And so for that reason, the PGRP has had a requirement for a data management and sharing plan since the early 2000s. So I will allow maybe Steve to come in.
Yeah, Steve, I can read you in if that's all right as well. So Dr. Stephen DeBelle is also a program director at NSF in the Division of Biological Infrastructure, Centers, Facilities, Additional Research Infrastructure. He received his PhD from York University in biology and has numerous appointments both in academia, research science, and industry. With a wide variety of experience, Dr. DeBelle uses genetic, molecular, pharmacological, and imaging tools to disambiguate biochemical and neural circuit processes that enable learning, consolidation, and recall of memories in flies. So his research aims to differentiate processes that are shared from those that distinguish different types of learning. And we can welcome Dr. DeBelle here. Dr. DeBelle, if you'd like to share some words to introduce yourself as well, that'd be awesome.
Sure, thanks, Brett. I guess the first thing I really want to say is that Suzanne and Anne, you did an awesome job talking about data management. I spent a lot of time both in academia and industry, as Brett mentioned, and it seems like those two different groups of people have different views of how to manage their data and how to work on it. And generally, the principle I mostly think about is we really want to maintain control of the data. That's really what both of you just kind of described in eloquent details. Mostly in academia, you want to share your data, and mostly in industry, you want to make sure other people don't get it. But of course, within groups, you want to share, and you want to mainly, certainly, ownership of data is part of what really is very important in industry. But for our purposes here, we really want to be able to control the data and make sure that the right people have appropriate access to it. And I actually really liked the discussion of, what happens when Anne gets her job at some other place and who's going to manage it. That's actually that's a problem that lots of people kind of forget about. And I've scurried about myself trying to find out who's going to take over from somebody left. So I'm really glad you mentioned that. Anyway, I think one of the biggest challenges that all of you who've been writing these documents come across is that you have as we've just seen, you have a lot of things to talk about, and you only get how many pages? 2 pages to say it. So ultimately, you need to become extremely proficient at squeezing a lot of information into a tiny space, so that the reviewers understand very well that you know exactly what you're doing, all about data. And that's mostly what I'm looking at when I see an incoming proposal. I want to see how well you said all of those things, because it was pretty well described in what the two of you shared with everyone. And so it's also easy to see when something is missing. And this is where you really, there's nothing that is really less important than something else. So I could probably wax on a little bit, but I'd rather hear from most of you. So I'm not sure what you'd like to do, Brett.
Yeah, that sounds great. Well, thank you both for those words of advice as well. So now we're going to open up to a wider discussion. Suzanne, if you just want to maybe stop sharing the screen, but so we can focus on our speakers here for this part. But we'll have an open discussion now where if anyone has a question that they'd like to ask our NSF representatives here, you can either raise your hand and I'll identify you to ask a question, or if you're not comfortable raising your hand or not in a position to do so, you can always type your question in the chat. I have a list of prepared questions, also some from the registration list that people were interested in hearing from our NSF representatives about. So maybe take a moment to think about what you'd like to know from NSF here regarding data management and sharing plans, or data management strategies in general. But to start, I guess, while people are writing up their questions and thinking, for both of you, Diane and Stephen, can you just talk a little bit about what the average data management and sharing plan looks like as attached to a grant, and maybe what the purpose of those DMPs are? You've both touched on that already, but really just like a holistic look from NSF side. We'd love to hear more about that.
And so, for NSF and the core programs, the bio directorate actually, and many of the directorates have a document at their website where they give you a sense of what is expected. And Steve is absolutely right. You don't have much space to talk about it. So we're really looking for, at that point, the reviewers are really looking for whether or not you have a good sense of where your data will be. You have a sense of what kind of data you will be collecting, and how you will share that. And in a project that may have just one lab, it's a very different kind of a plan than if you're a BII and you have many institutions and individuals collecting similar types of data, but you all have to integrate that data, right? And so a lot of times what we've we do is we save the details of a data management plan to after the panels and review process has run its course. And we are now at the post-panel part of the process where we talk to individuals who are PIs of a grant that we'd like to consider funding. And that's when we get into the nitty-gritty details. And I guess the purpose of these really in the proposals is just to satisfy requirements that have been set forth by the government in terms of public access policy for data and publications. And then aside from that, it's important for every research team to be able to understand how your team will access and use that data. And so I think that ahead of everything, you know how you would think about talking to statisticians before you set up a genetic screen or a quantitative genetic screen, a QTL analysis. You really want to think about what kinds of data you're going to generate and what form that's going to take and what you need to collect and how you're going to present that in your repository, regardless of where it is. And there, I can talk about, you know, other efforts that are in the plant world, where we're seriously taking a very hard look and putting in effort and money into developing ways in which databases and repositories and projects can start to communicate with each other and integrate data sets that were never thought about, but now have been collected and would actually add to the analysis by being able to be read and linked to, let's say, sequence resources, for example.
I can add a little bit. One thing that really caught my ear as Suzanne and Anne were speaking earlier was this issue around accessibility and being able to actually find data. And often, I mean, it sounds like it should be really easy, but if your goal is to generate useful information for others, there is actually, it's a non-trivial task in many cases. If you're looking broadly around the scientific community, you have to make sure everybody's following the guidelines for identifiers for data. And it's not the case that everybody plays by these rules.
Yeah, sure.
And so it's really very important that, Diane and I will be super impressed if we see any indication at all in your data management plan that you actually know how you're doing this and what you're doing and what those standards are, and you're going to do those, play by that game. And as all of you are probably looking for data yourselves, you know how challenging and sort of frustrating it is when you know that a bunch of folks have been out there collecting important data and you can't find it. And that's maybe not in the first round of evaluation of a proposal, particularly for a BII, because we can't see everything in 2 pages, but certainly in the conversations that we would have in a follow-up meeting with a potential candidate BII, we would certainly want to know how that's being done.
Can I also add something?
Absolutely.
So one of the reasons why the BII program was set up was because we anticipated that the BIIs would be using a diverse set of organisms, and it might not be the same kinds of data that has been collected historically. But now you're all getting together and trying to integrate all those data sets. And so we're hoping that the BIIs actually take the lead and help communities, disparate communities, start to think about the standards and start to think about hey, I'd like to interact with this BII. I'd like to have, access to their data. Can I join? And in order to do that, they have to be able to have their data in a form that can be integrated with the other data. And so we're hoping that that's the case. I can say that with the plant community, we started in the early 2000s. And at that time, we asked proposers to have addressed certain questions like, standards and where are you going to put this data and the type of data, etc. And at some point, we were able to not have that requirement in our proposals. We were able to have the generic data management plan because the communities started to understand the properties of a good data management plan. And they were sharing that data and they were sharing the germplasms and they were getting together. And so we have an RCN that's called, that is led by a consortium, a grassroots consortium of database and database curators and administrators who have gotten together and started to agree upon standards, agree upon the types of metadata that needs to be associated with genes, so that all of the data in these long-term repositories can now be accessed for analysis, answering different questions. But it took 20 years. So we're hoping the BIIs are going to help us move that needle a lot faster, for the diverse animal research communities that are out there that really need some help.
Awesome.
Well,
Thank you
the
both.
BIIs are actually, if you've looked carefully at the list of the BIIs in the program, it really does span pretty much all of the biology that I can think of. It's all over the place. And in some of those areas of biology, people are still collecting data with pencil and paper. And you're in the field. Sometimes this is just how it happens. And this is data that you might actually want. And in consideration of how this might be integrated, there should be a way of doing that. And I don't know if any of you are in this category, but hopefully that's part of your thinking around it. And something else, Diane, you said that it triggered my memories of not too long ago memories, but as a geneticist, I spend a lot of time looking for genes that do certain functions in my particular animal of choice. And what I notice is that over the years, the standardized nomenclature, which is a kind of data management, presumably people pay attention to it. Almost every single gene that you look for has about 20 different versions of names for it because people fail to be strict around how they document their data. And so any particular gene you might want to look for, phosphodiesterase in a fruit fly, there's only one gene doing that, but there are 20 names for the same thing because of people not paying attention. And so being fastidious around this is actually part of the job too. And you can't write that on your 2 pages, but I'm just saying, as data managers, you have to think about it.
Yeah, great.
Right. Well, thank you both. And I'd like, Stephen, your point on the coming from a genetics background. I don't think it's shocking that both of you have strong genetics backgrounds, and genetics has really shown us the way in a lot of these big data management projects in the last few years. But we do have a question in the chat from Nick Hoffman here. So this is going back to our little introduction and specifically about the care principles. So what do you look for when reviewing a DMP regarding ethical considerations that Anne talked about, and we focused on the care principles? So the context is that they're familiar with some other avenues, some other grants that are specifically advocating for the care principles. And I believe Nick has even brought up in previous workshops the care principles as well. So if you have any opinions on that, we'd love to hear them.
Diane, you want to take it?
I think you should take this one.
Well, the
I'm
first thing I
Fran.
look for is whether IACUC and IRB are carefully documented in the proposal. And in order for you to work with humans or vertebrates, at least, the review boards for in both cases have to already have done a very strict review of the plan. So without an appropriate document, I'm very suspicious and going to hold the proposal up. So at least in terms of those cases. But we are moving forward and are thinking about what needs to be of concern, and having a spine doesn't necessarily distinguish the need for caring about an animal, in my view. And so I'd like to see a little bit of documentation in somewhere in the proposal, whether it's in the data management plan or not, that refers to the ethical treatment of animals in general. And then certainly a broadly, a carefully written management plan that discusses data that should or should not be available to certain individuals, whether it's because of ethical considerations or not. And maybe Nick, please chime in. If it's strictly about the ethical issue, then that's something that really needs to be well specified in the document. You really, if it's not already in the IRB or the IACUC document, it needs to be specified in the data management plan.
I would also say that again, what the reviewers need to understand is that you understand that this is important. But if the proposal is going to be funded, then there are requirements that you need to meet, and we cannot make an award without an approved IACUC protocol. We cannot approve and award a proposal that has human subjects and how you're going to deal with that. So it really depends upon the project. And I should also mention that many of the agencies have their own data management plan requirements. And so you need to think about that as well. And then finally, I would say that you need to think about data management plans as like a living document. It is going to change with time because, the requirements by the agencies and the government will change, but also you're going to change the kind of research that you're doing, kind of data that you're collecting. And that's important to consider how you're going to modify your data management plan to address all of the changes.
So that idea of kind of needing to be flexible and have some change later in the plan kind of brings up another question that was submitted on our online forum, and that's about kind of NSF enforcement policies around data management plans. So of course you're going to get the grant proposal. It's going to have this beautiful plan all laid out on those 2 pages for you. But I guess later on down the road, after people have come and gone in the grant and things have changed over time, does NSF have any mechanisms for tracking follow through on these DMPs? And are there any recommendations for making sure the team actually sticks to the plan when appropriate?
Yes, indeed. NSF, in the old days, what we did was, in the Plant Genome Research Program, was to have PIs fill out a table, data release and project management. The data deliverables were listed as data products and resources, and they had to map to the specific aims and objectives in the proposal or budget impact statement if the scope was revised. And we also had a space for where the data and research will be deposited, when, and then who was responsible. So that when the annual reports came in, we looked at the table and looked to see if there was a report on data release, etc. Now, that's a lot of work on the for the National Science Foundation program directors. And so what happened was, when NSF decided to make data management plans required for all proposals, they put in an automatic block into the system so that if a program director has concerns about data release, they can just not approve the annual report. And then what that does is that when it becomes overdue, it actually blocks everyone associated with that project in terms of any financial actions. So this could be new awards, this could be no cost extensions, this could be getting supplements, and it affects all the senior personnel, the PI and co-PIs. And so if you think about a BII and you have how many different senior personnel, all that has to happen is that there's a problem with data release. And then everybody is blocked on every single NSF action that requires money. And wow, when that first went into effect, you would not believe how it snowballs. And, you know, especially at the end of the fiscal year, when we're trying to get out all of the continuing grant increments, you know, we could lose the funds if we don't get it out in time. And so getting your annual reports in is really important ahead of time. It becomes due 90 days before the end of the reporting period. 90 days. That doesn't mean that it's due on the expiration date of the reporting period, because the next day after that, it's overdue and the block is initiated by the system. So that's how we were able in the Plant Genome Research Program to help the communities share and disseminate their information. And now it's across the board at NSF.
So that sounded like a bad story, Diane, that everybody's going to get cut off. But
it does. It was really bad because, you know, the BIIs are what, about 15, 16 million over 6 years, right? The Plant Genome Research Program at the height of its budget had $15 to $20 million projects with 4, 5, 6 institutions.
Yeah.
And there were times at which we would have like 5 different projects being held up because of a overdue annual report.
Yeah.
Yeah, it could get really bad.
So for your benefit, though, making sure that the data management is described in the annual report as requested in the actual form, and in the BIIs especially, there's plenty of places for you to do that, and there's not a page limit on the report. But what can actually happen is, let's say in a worst case scenario, that one of the institutes fails to provide a sufficient amount of information. Well, the program director responsible for managing the institute will engage with you right away and tell you, hey, we're missing this or that, please add the following information. Right. So it's not like there's a problem with it, and it's a back and forth discussion. So if something happens to be missing, that's easily remedied, and if there's too much information, it's more than we expected, well, that's okay. You'll get your increment for sure if that's the potential holdup. So it's once you have an award, and I think that was the question really. It's a back and forth conversation. So it's not like you have one chance to get it right and then you lose your money. It's not that at all. It's simply
no, not at all.
The discussion that goes on. But the timing of it is important, as Diane mentioned. I mean, you don't want to be late on it.
That's right.
In some cases, you don't want to be too early because, hey, maybe you're on the verge of a finding you want to add to your report. So maybe you want to, within the last quarter of that reporting year, you can submit it right up to the last day, and it's not late. And certainly, we would love to see the exciting outcome if that's what you're waiting for, rather than get it in as soon as the window opens to submit. So, and as always, the rule should always be the first thing that every program director, I'm hoping, is telling everyone is please communicate with your program director.
That's right.
For whatever it is.
We are on your side, actually. We're trying to make sure that you don't get into trouble because we want you to be successful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really good to hear for a lot of these early career researchers on the call right now who may only think about like big NSF at DC and how you're going to review all of their GRFPs and whatnot. But it's really more of a team effort is what I've gathered.
Yeah, and you can never communicate too much. So people will always want to engage with you. And if you have even if you're starting out and you have a question and you're not sure if it's appropriate for the program or what is the program even, just reach out to somebody. You can reach out to Diane and I if you don't know any of the other ones, and we can say, oh yes, you should talk to so-and-so, and we'll hook you up.
All right, well, that sounds awesome. Thank you both. We have another question in the chat from Keely here. So this is about how is evaluating a data management plan complicated by the inclusion of like everybody's new favorite machine learning models or AI models or affiliated collections of labeled data. So thinking particularly about accessibility of built models, which can be tricky, I guess, Keely, if I'm understanding, maybe in sharing the model or considering like an iterative model accessible.
Well, I mean, some of that does not sound like it would be an absolute requirement for the management plan. It might be an exciting and cool thing to do and maybe report on in some way, but it may not be critical for the plan. So there are defined things to go into the plan. It doesn't need to be sort of its own research project, but maybe don't exclude it. I mean, yeah, we might not spend so much time focusing on it if it's just a point of interest. But I would more focus on the critical elements that were already nicely outlined in this workshop. So, Diane.
I do think I'd like to mention that as we move forward, artificial intelligence and machine learning methods and modeling is going to become very front and center for focus areas for new funding opportunities. So I would just sign up for NSF updates so that you are made aware of the different funding opportunities. And then you can read the new DCLs or the new program solicitations and find out what NSF is actually looking for.
That's a really great add. And I guess that kind of dovetails into another question is that we have a community here of early career researchers from some undergrads up to early stage faculty joining us today. So if you could maybe both peer into your crystal balls of the future and what kind of like skills around data management sharing where BIIs were supposed to be more integrative institutes, maybe what skills do you foresee becoming really important for some young career scientists to be focusing on now so that they're going to be prepared for some challenges in the future?
Well, don't limit yourself to a single set of tools. Try to reach out and not just collaborate with people who do different things, but actually try to absorb and become some of those other things yourself. And I would say the earlier you start this, the better. And I fully regret that I did not become the best programmer in town when I was going through grad school. I was barely passable. Now I live and die by the collaborations I have with people who do that. And I would say the more broadly trained you are and the more tentacles you send off into all these different areas, the better. Business school, even, anything that helps you build your skill set. So anyway, that's I think the only advice I can really, that burns in my mind about what to do next, is always to be a broader scientist.
And I think the BIIs are preparing you for that, because I think one of the real challenges is trying to understand what what a scientist in a different field is expecting an outcome to be. Because if you feel comfortable in discussing projects with engineers and statisticians, physicists, mathematicians, social scientists, I think that you'll be well prepared, because you'll be already thinking, you're already on the same page, and you're not going to be talking past each other. And I think that's really important. And also, just remember this: what we're doing here is focusing on the science, and it's the questions you're asking, and it's the data that you need to address those questions. And so think of the questions and get excited about the questions, and that'll drive you to doing what you need to do to get your data and to collaborate with the right people,
That's fantastic. We'll open it up maybe for a second for any other questions from the chat, or you can raise your hand on here and we'll call on you.
I don't think it's going to be a crystal ball, Brett. It might be something we haven't yet imagined that will give us this foresight. I guess the other thing I would say is you can never communicate your science well enough. You have to speak with people who don't know anything about it, or people who are fully informed, and try to figure out how you share your information with people in some way that can be improved.
That's a really good point. Thank you, Stephen. Seeing no more questions from the group, I'll go to some of the pre-submitted ones. So we had some questions about, I guess, data longevity as well. So data longevity could, I guess, mean the length of a project or indefinitely. But what are the requirements when we're thinking about these data management plans at the start of a project for how long data should be available for? And does a good plan include like data storage in perpetuity?
In the old days, we said, yeah, you have to, like get out your data either by publication or in data repositories. But I think now what people are, it costs so much to store this data that in fact it's become cheaper to just redo the experiment and get the data than it is to store the data, right? And so you really have to think about whether it's necessary to keep it in perpetuity and how much that's going to cost, because you need to budget that into your proposal. I've seen so many people now, because of our open data access policy, where they haven't actually requested enough funds to publish in an open access journal. Oh my gosh, it is incredibly expensive. And so when you think about repositories, you have to think about how much that's going to cost and whether that's a good value,
I've had conversations with people about how long do you keep your data, and there doesn't seem, and I'm not aware of an NSF rule on that. Or a federal government rule even generally. But what would be a savvy way to answer that question for you might be to say, well, we want to keep it for a specified period of time and justify that time, because it might be that you anticipate the value of that data will expire after a decade or after 15 years, and it will be built upon in a way that you can somehow justify or describe. But if that is a point that you would like to address in the data management plan at any place. I would say justify it yourself and say why you want to have it for a particular time and who's going to be using it.
I would also say that in the past, we have actually provided additional funds for deposition of, for example, seed to long-term repositories. Mm-hmm. So it's totally possible that even if you haven't thought about it and hadn't planned for it, that the programs can actually help out. And that's why you really need to talk to your program directors, because they can tell you whether there are funds for that or not.
That's really good advice. What we're learning today is a lot of communication with program officers. That's a good advice, I think.
Yes.
Suzanne has also put in the chat some points on Zenodo or other repositories which you can upload data for free at certain points. Suzanne, did you want to add any to that? I know you've talked in previous workshops about data repositories as well.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess the cost of having data in perpetuity kind of depends on how you're sharing it, which in turn depends on like what your options are in terms of the size. So the size limit for Zenodo is 50 gigabytes per data set, but you can upload multiple sequencing data. I think I'm pretty sure that submission to NCBI is also free, but depending on what kind of data it is, it may be a headache to upload it all, or in some cases, like where if you have metagenome assembled genomes that or MAGs that don't meet a certain completeness threshold, they might not accept them at all. So with those kinds of data that are both large and where there is not a free place to deposit it publicly, or if you're not ready to deposit it publicly, that's where the storage costs of and in some cases website maintenance costs of keeping it long term really come into play.
And I think that as we go into thinking about artificial intelligence and machine learning, where are we going to store those training sets? Mm-hmm. And how are we going to do the computation? We have to think about it, and we have to be continuously talking about it so that you keep the federal agencies aware of where the community is and what the status is, because we may not be privy to that information. And that's why, again, you should talk to your program directors.
So on this note of data in perpetuity, and particularly like this big data revolution that we've all been going through, I think we could say like genomics and the omics revolutions are really leading the way in that. But our BIIs have, and different research groups have all focused on, generating as much data as possible, and the degree of which data we can generate is greater than ever before. So you both shared a little bit of the viewpoints on, do you need to store the data for so long? But could you maybe talk more about what NSF's philosophy is on these big data efforts? And at the start of a grant proposal, so at the start of when we're writing a DMP, what considerations might be needed for a group that's really looking at generating like very large amounts of data?
Knowledge about how big that actually might be and whether you have capacity for it. I mean, that's the first thing that everybody, I think, is considering. Can you actually, have you planned it well enough that you can actually do what you're suggesting? And I have to imagine that in many cases people make a plan and know the document you submit and maybe gets approved by reviewers may reflect an idea, but when boots are on the ground and you're collecting it, you might realize, oh my gosh, I've got way more data than I can store. And then in come the supplement requests. We need this, we didn't know, and people review that people will view that favorably because, well, oh, you're actually doing maybe better job, but it's a bit of a planning issue, in a sense too, that you didn't recognize the actual reality of the challenge. But certainly plan to the best of your ability to understand what sort of storage needs you will have, and all the other management needs to make all the things that were described. Sure, if you come up against a problem like you need a whole lot more storage, well, that could either be a supplement or it might be something bigger. But these are possible things here at the NSF that you can move forward in the case where something wasn't exactly as you thought it would be. So.
And I just seem to remember a presentation I saw where I think it's SIZE. Is it SIZE or the Office of Advanced Cyber Infrastructure?
Mm-hmm.
That the National Artificial Intelligence Resource. There's actually some place where you can go to get resources to do the computational work. And if I would look on my computer for the web link, but I tend to, I'll have to shut down my video. So I'll do that and I'll find it and I'll put it in the chat, okay?
You can feel free to send to us afterwards as well.
Oh, okay.
We're going to send out the recording link, and that would be great to go with it as well.
Okay, I'll do that.
So then as just one last quick question. So we talked about data storage, but data availability is another thing. And I think Aiden in the chat has made a very astute question that maybe we're all guilty of sometimes, but is just saying that data will be available on request and stored privately a valid strategy, or are there any ways we can maybe take our data sharing policies a bit farther?
I totally understand why that might be true, right? Because in the past, we've had problems with groups taking data from a website and publishing on that data before our scientists were able to do that. And that negatively impacted early career investigators, like postdocs and graduate students who could no longer get their work published in a journal because it was already out there. And so again, if you have questions about, what would be acceptable, you can talk to a program director. You can tell them what kind of data you're going to have and how long it's going to take you to publish. And I think that the policy now is that it should either be deposited or published within a year after the project has ended, something like that. And this prevents people like my thesis advisor, who took 7 years to publish my paper for my thesis. Mm. Yeah, that won't happen anymore.
That's a statement you see a lot. What's here in the chat. Often that's sort of a one-liner ending to the data management plan. But it is somewhat reflective, I think, of reality, as Diane mentioned. You can't just sort of collect the data and throw it out there and expect, when you haven't written it up. I think that's a justified thing, and you can't just hang on to it forever. I mean, after all, it is paid for with public dollars, so there should be some public accessibility.
So in the past, what we've allowed projects to do is to put a disclaimer on their website that if someone were to use the data that is being shared, that they must acknowledge where they got that data. Definitely. And that has actually stopped, I think, to a certain extent, the stuffed people's data.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you both for that. And we are at time now. That conversation went by super fast for me, so thank you both. If you both maybe want to share some closing thoughts on whatever advice you have for a group of early career scientists regarding data management, we can take a couple of minutes to do that. And in the chat, I'll be posting a form for any feedback from our participants. We're trying to host these types of workshops more often, and your participation allows us to get people like from NSF to come discuss with us at a deeper level. So maybe Diane, do you want to give us your closing thoughts for today?
I think I'd like to highlight that or emphasize that you should think about the questions that you want to address in science. What are you extremely interested in addressing? And then think about what data types you will need to access and to address that question. And then it goes from there. And I think that if you always do that, I think you'll be way ahead of the curve.
My comments are really, I want to copy what Anne and Suzanne said earlier. It was really well presented, and it seemed very complete. It was more complete than there's more information and more detail there than most data management plans that I've ever seen. So I think if you follow those rules, and then when you get to the end of your 2 pages, maybe you have to condense it. It was very, very nicely done. The other thing that I always did when I first started writing grants, and I think it still applies today, is get your hands on a really well-written, funded proposal and follow the plan. See what somebody else did that worked. And any questions, if you're not sure about it, then the other thing I would always say, and we'll say it one more time, is call your program director and talk to them.
All right, and that's all the time we have for today. Let's give a round of applause, virtual or reality, for our NSF representatives today. That was a wonderful discussion, and thank you both so much for coming.
Thanks for having us.
You're welcome. Thank you
Pleasure.
for having us.
We'll send out this recording to all of those who registered for the workshop, so be on the lookout for that, and otherwise be on the lookout for additional workshops around data management that are to come in the next months as well. All right, so thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
All right, great job, everyone.
Thank you.
Stop the recording.